quarantine day 200, 500. No, I don't know what day it is, but it feels like forever, doesn't it, right? But you know what? We're trying to kind of provide some inspiration for you to help you through these difficult times. And what I decided to, what kind of God laid upon my heart was led me back to a book that I read about 10, 15 years ago called The Red Sea Rules. 10 God-given strategies for difficult times. And let's be honest, we're in a difficult time. For some of us, it's more difficult than others, but all of us are outside of our norm, and this has been difficult. And so we began last week, and we're using the experience of the Israelites when they were trapped between a rock and a hard place. They found themselves in a difficult time, in a difficult place. They found themselves between a Red Sea and a charging Pharaoh and his army, and they didn't know what to do. And so we learn through this passage that there are rules that we can apply to every difficult situation that will help us through it. Last week, we looked at rule number 1. Rule number 1 is that we need to realize that God means for you to be where you are. And listen, we started with probably the toughest of all of them, because a lot of people don't want to believe that God might have placed us exactly where we are today. We don't want to believe that God is in charge, that he has put us here and there's a reason we're going through this. We want to think that this is something evil that's happening, and because of evil, we have found ourselves here. But ultimately, if we believe that God is sovereign, that even evil has to go through him, and that he has to give permission for it to happen. So either we are here because God placed us here, or we are here because he allowed us to be here. And you see, when we are here, whether it's a crisis like maybe a hurricane or a tornado or a famine or a loss of a job or many other crises that we can find ourselves in, a lot of times we begin asking questions, right? We begin asking questions. Maybe some of those questions that you're asking right now as we go through this COVID-19 crisis is how did this happen, right? Like, how did this even happen? Where did it start? And as we're trying to figure out how it happened, we naturally begin looking for who to point a finger at, right? Who's to blame? Who started this thing? Where did it come from? We think it came from a place in China, but we don't really know exactly all that went into this and how this came to be. But isn't that true? When we're going through a difficult time, we start trying to point fingers. Many people out there are trying to, right now, let's point at either our president or some other leader or anything else to the Chinese. They are ones doing this on purpose. I mean, we try to point a finger at who is to blame when maybe that's not the right question to ask. Maybe another question is, why is this happening to me? Why did I lose my job? Why am I stuck here at home and I'm an extrovert and I'm going crazy, right? Why is this happening to me? Maybe another question is how can I get out of this? I mean, how long is this going to take? And what can I do? Can I wear the right mask? What can I do to help us get out of this? Is by me staying home going to make this end quicker, or is this going to go on for an extended period of time? How can I get out of this? What can I do? And then maybe if there's nothing I can do, then I start looking outside and I go, well, if I can't do anything, where is the help going to come from? Now let's apply those questions, because people are people, right? People are people. The people of Israelites are very similar to us today in the questions they would have been asking. So imagine yourself in their situation. They probably would have been asking like how do we get in this mess, right? Egypt was tough, but I wasn't fearful of my life every day and every moment. Even slavery has got to be better than being destroyed by an army. And then as this reality for them began to set in, they began pointing fingers. And of course, I'm sure Moses got the brunt of it. And they were saying things like, how stupid is Moses? I mean, he led us right here. This has got to be the worst tactical place to be in all of the wilderness that we were wandering. But here we are between a rock and a hard place. Moses is either incompetent, foolish, or maybe he just has it in for us. Maybe he doesn't like us. And he truly is trying to get us killed. And then as they let that go, or maybe they just stopped focusing on that for a while, they began that oh, woe is me questions like, why me? Like, what did I do? Right? What did I do? I didn't cause the plagues. I didn't turn the water into blood. I didn't bring all those locusts to destroy the fields. I didn't even call the death angel down. So why am I here? Why isn't it just Moses? Why me? And then maybe some ingenious members of the society began thinking outside of the box of ways that they can get out of their situation. Maybe one was very sneaky and quiet, and maybe he thought that in the middle of the night he could sneak past the army and get away from this situation. Or maybe somebody was a really good swimmer, right? Maybe somebody's a really good swimmer, and they decided, I'm just going to swim across the Red Sea. I'm just, I'll make it. I'm either going to drown, or I'd rather drown than die to this army, so I'm going to swim across this Red Sea. And the irony of this last one, is that imagine that guy or girl who is a great swimmer, right? And they begin swimming across the Red Sea, and they get about halfway across the Red Sea. They're starting to have problems, and then all of a sudden the water comes out from underneath them, and they drop to the floor. And they see, if they lived through that, they see their friends walking across on dry land. You see, lesson 2 kind of begins with these questions. Lesson 2 begins by people in crisis asking the wrong questions. Some of the questions are up there, right? But sometimes we ask the wrong questions. And even though they're not bad questions, that for believers, they're not the right question. And so we have to turn to Scripture to help us find the right question and the right answer through crisis. And so we're going to continue in that chapter 14 of Exodus. Chapter 14, we looked at verse 1 and 2 last week. We're going to look at verse 3 and 4 this week. Verse 3 and 4 says this: For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get the glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. You see, the passage starts off with Pharaoh, and I can imagine Pharaoh sitting in his castle, stewing over letting these slaves go, still mourning over the loss of his child, and this anger rising up in him. And as he looked out and he heard back from the scouts that were following them, they were probably reporting back to him that the Israelites don't seem to know where they're going. They're going this way, and then that way, and then this way, and then that way, and their leadership maybe isn't really what it's supposed to be. And so Pharaoh, it says God hardened his heart, and he decided to pursue after them to destroy them. And God brought all that to be, it says in this passage, so that that I will get the glory, and that the Egyptians shall know that I'm the Lord. You see, that is the whole purpose of God. That's the whole purpose that we are here, is so that we could glorify God, and that we would make God known to all of the nations. You see, God demonstrated his power in this rock in a hard place because he determined his power over two things. He demonstrated his power over his enemies and the elements, right? He demonstrated his power by destroying or submerging the Pharaoh and his army and destroying them in the Red Sea. And he showed his power over the elements by parting that Red Sea so that this camp of 1 million strong could walk across on dry land. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to encounter that. First, you were fearful for your life, but somewhere down deep you remembered that God, all the miracles that God had done and the plagues that God had brought and the death angel, that your child was spared. And then all of a sudden that sea is parted and you're walking across looking at two walls of sea on either side, and you get across to the other side, and then as the army is charging after you, they're then drowned and destroyed in the middle of the sea. What must have that been like? I can't imagine that anybody that encountered that saw that lived through that would ever forget it. And that's why that in God's word, time after time after time, when they were trying to remember that God was a way maker, they went back to this experience. And a couple weeks ago on Sunday morning, I think it was the first Sunday morning that we streamed and nobody was there with us, we read and we did this passage of Psalm 136, 10 through 15. And that's the beginning of where God was laying upon my heart what to do during this time. But if you'll turn with that passage, Psalm 136, 10 through 15, it says this. To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, for his steadfast love endures forever, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who divided the Red Sea in two, for his steadfast love endures forever, but overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever. You see, that was a song, just like many of our songs, our praise songs, we sing and we repeat things over and over to remind ourselves again of either a truth of God, a promise of God, or a rescue of God. And here they were reminding themselves again, and they kept repeating that same refrain. For his steadfast love endures forever, for his steadfast love endures forever. And they were remembering all the ways, and none more popular, none more important than the encounter at the Red Sea. So rule number two. Rule number two is this. Be more concerned for God's glory than for your own relief. Folks, this is another hard lesson, and not one that I would say that I've perfected by any stretch of my imagination, right? But you see, if God created us in his image, he created us for his own glory. And when we go through difficult times, we need to look and say, what's the best thing that we can do where God would get the glory, even if I am not removed from my trial. So God getting the glory. And, as I tried to kind of come to grasp and look at reasons and ways how that happens, I always have to look to our Savior, Jesus Christ, because he is our ultimate example in everything. And I found two passages in the Gospel of John where Jesus himself practiced this rule and showed us how to do it better than anyone else. The first one is found in John 9, verses 1 through 3. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. And it says this. As he, Jesus, passed by, he saw a blind man from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. See, notice something. Notice that the disciples asked the wrong question, right? They got in a difficult situation. They were looking at a blind man, and they were trying to be more religious than they really were, trying to be somebody that they weren't, somebody that Jesus didn't want them to be. And they asked them the religious question, because in the religious realms, when somebody was either sick or blind or had leprosy, it was considered that that person either sinned and then God sent that sickness upon them, or that their parents sinned and then that sin was visited upon their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And so this religious idea that when they saw somebody that was sick, that they were that way because they had placed themselves there. And now given, and I'm going to say this, that sometimes consequences of our sin lead us to get sick, or might cause us to have something wrong with us. But in principle, I don't think that's what God had in mind when he discovered this. And we can see it here. They were trying to be religious, but they asked the wrong question. But Jesus took the focus off that blind man, because ultimately it's not all about the blind man, but it's about God's glory. And he said that it was not this man that sinned or his parents. So Jesus debunked that. Said, listen, don't worry about who sinned or who didn't sin. That's not what's most important. What's most important is that God is glorified in the situation. And so how is God going to be glorified in the situation? God's going to be glorified when Jesus heals that man of his blindness. And so for however long that man had lived with his blindness, he lived with his blindness because at some point in his life, He was going to encounter Jesus the Messiah, and Jesus the Messiah was going to save him from his blindness, and God was going to be glorified through that. And that was more important than all the years that he lived before that being blind. And that's how God works with this principle or this rule. The second time, John chapter 11, just a few pages, a few chapters later, John chapter 11, 1 through 4, it says this: Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, in the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, him who you love is ill. But the Lord heard it and said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Later on in this passage, Lazarus dies. And Jesus and his disciples come, and they come to the sisters, and they are grieving over the loss of their brother. And they ask Jesus the questions, and they ask him, Jesus, where were you? If you were here, you could have saved him. But now my brother is dead. You see, even these sisters that love Jesus with all of their heart and soul and mind and strength, they asked the wrong question in crisis. The question wasn't about Lazarus and whether he was dead or alive, but how is God going to be glorified through this experience? And we find that God is glorified through this experience when Jesus stands before a cave with a rock strewn in front of it. And 3 days after Lazarus is dead, he screams out, or he cries out to his friend, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus comes walking out of that tomb, grave clothes and all. And they are reunited. And he lives again. We don't know for how long. But it's not important about whether he lived or he died. What's important, that he was where God needed him to be so that Jesus could be glorified by doing that miracle. So whether somebody needs to be blind or dead and in the grave, if God desires to place them there so that he can be glorified, what's most important is that they're there and that God glorifies his name. You see, Jesus in both of these took the focus off a person and he placed it on God. And he took the eyes off an immediate circumstance and he placed it on an eternal truth. So how can we apply this rule to ourselves? And I think if you're like me, it's fairly obvious, right? Whenever you find yourself in a crisis or any time, be more concerned for God's glory than for your own relief or your own comfort or your own needs. And wow, is this hard? This is a mature principle of God, and trust me, you're not going to get it right every time. But if you can get it right once or twice or 3 times or 4 times, that when you're going through a difficult time, you just stop worrying about yourself. And you start worrying about how God is going to be glorified through it. Maybe there's something that we can do to help us. I came up kind of with a phrase, actually 3 short phrases that, just like the psalmist did by kind of redoing that, for his love will endure forever, but these short phrases that when we're going through difficult times, it will help us remember and help us try to be the people that God has called us to be, the church that called us to be, that we would glorify God instead of worrying about our own needs. And it says this way: when we go through difficult time, in his own way, God is going to do things his own way. God's ways are not our ways. God's ways are higher. So in his own way. Second, in his own time. God might rescue us from our circumstances, but it might be longer than we think. I don't believe the sisters wanted their brother to be dead and in the grave for 3 days before he was rescued. But that was God's timing. So in his own way, in his own time, for his own glory. Coastal, remember, this is not about us. We are in this moment today to glorify God. So let me encourage you. I know it's not easy. Take your eyes off yourself. Find a way where God can be glorified today through your situation. Listen, I love you. I miss you. I can't wait, man. The day that we get to gather again, we're going to have a party like never before, and we're going to celebrate that. But until then, be safe, be strong, keep your eyes on Jesus, and look for his own glory. God bless.